The people in the country probably have never heard of Kids in the Hall before.
No, they never have.
And they're seeing you guys sitting here and they think, well, what do they do?
We do a lot of the mirror. Oh no, that's
That's in the workshops. I don't know.
How would you describe it?
just a lot of weird stuff. Sometimes it's dark, and sometimes it's happy and sweet, and
how about
sometimes
macabre mirth makers? Is that right?
If you are any sort of fan of comedy, then you definitely understand the importance of the Canadian sketch comedy troupe The Kids in the Hall. The five-man group, Scott Thompson, Kevin McDonald, Mark McKinney, Dave Foley, and Bruce McCulloch, got their start in the 1980s, but still have left a lasting impact on the comedy scene to this day. A sort of antidote to Saturday Night Live's pop culture heavy format, The Kids in the Hall brought an irreverent, chaotic brand of comedy to TV as their series, which ran from 1988 to 1995, skewered real life, stretching satire to its furthest limits. Though not as well known as Monty Python, the Kids' influence is immeasurable as they truly redefined sketch comedy, helping pave the way for The State, the Upright Citizens Brigade, and even Lonely Island. So despite never really truly making it mainstream, in the comedy world, the Kids in the Hall are comedy gods. Yet, despite all of their critical fame and their devoted comedy fans, and despite the fact that for pretty much the entire 1990s, Comedy Central played nothing but Kids in the Hall reruns all day, every day, it still seems that this Canadian comedy troupe should be more widely known. So why aren't they? As influential as they were, why is it after all these years that the Kids in the Hall, all of them who are still actively writing and performing, still feel more like a fringe act than the big mainstream success they should be? Let's find out. The Kids in the Hall started as a truly bare-bones act, writing and staging a completely new sketch show each week at a Toronto rock venue called the Rivoli. Fun fact, their name came from a bit from legendary old-school comic Sid Caesar, who, whenever a joke bombed, blamed it on his writers, calling them the Kids in the Hall. The troupe had no sets and barely any costumes, but brought their characters to life through sheer talent and determination. Mark McKinney recalls that, quote, committing to those more difficult characters was something we had to do to bring the audience along when all we had was a wig drenched in flop sweat. And because a brand new show had to be created every week, the gang really became a self-contained unit as they only had themselves to rely on. Every week, if somebody had a sketch that works, it was like, oh, thank God, Bruce McCulloch remembered. And though the Kids in the Hall were one of the rare sketch comedy groups who took sketch comedy, typically considered a disposable means to a more lucrative end, such as a sitcom or movie deal, although that did come later, and treated it as its own art form, that doesn't mean they were comedy snobs. Just the opposite. Dave Foley was a high school dropout, McKinney flunked out of college, and Scott Thompson was kicked out of Toronto's York University. The Kids in the Hall shied away from comedy navel-gazing. There was always a poo-pooing of theoretical discussions, McKinney told Vulture in 2015. McCulloch added that, quote, whenever we'd have a theoretical conversation about comedy, we'd stop because we knew if we kept at it, we'd break up. McCulloch also noted, quote, we all grew up as unhappy young men or young men who hadn't found their place. We were of the suburbs. We were of parents that were always getting drunk and or having heart attacks. Said McKinney, quote, we went through this period as single guys with no lives and terrible jobs where sketch was all we did for 5 years. It was the reason to get up in the morning. And though SNL was definitely on the horizon and a natural progression, the troupe never felt that they could be a part of that popular world. The SNL people felt like they were in a limo you wanted to get in. We ain't that, McCulloch said. We're guys hanging around at home saying weird shit. Some of that thinking may be because, though gaining popularity in Toronto, it was almost unheard of for Toronto comedy groups to get poached by talent scouts, which meant that the Kids stayed intact for years before they made any money. This allowed them to cohere as a group without having any concerns about making it big, because in the Kids' minds, this was as good as it was ever going to get. Then someone came along and changed it all for the Kids in the Hall, and that person was Lorne Michaels. Michaels, SNL creator, comedy career maker, and fellow Canadian, had his eyes on the Kids in the Hall just as they were starting to make a name for themselves in the Toronto area. In fact, he almost nearly broke them up before they could really make an impact on modern comedy. In 1985, just as the troupe was getting their legs underneath them, Michaels, who was just making his return to Saturday Night Live, hired McCulloch and McKinney as staff writers. They lasted only one season, but it did cause the Kids in the Hall to necessitate having a one-year hiatus. But a few years later, the SNL guru, who had remained a big fan of the group and their work, set the gears in motion for a Kids in the Hall TV show for the Canadian channel the CBC, simultaneously getting it on HBO as well. The Kids in the Hall being on 2 channels at once immediately brought in a much wider audience, even though that audience was more alternative than mainstream. But if you watched their show during that time, you were not only an immediate fan, you were a fan for life. The characters they created were wonderfully weird yet decidedly sweet at the same time. Whether it was Buddy Cole, Gavin, the Sizzle Sisters, Francesca Fiore, Sir Simon Milligan and Hecubus, Kathy and Kathy, the I'm Crushing Your Head guy, and of course, the Chicken Lady, the kids gave their devoted fans memorable characters with memorable catchphrases without it feeling hacky or pandering. More importantly, they never made fun of the characters that came up with. They loved them, and in return, we loved them as well. With their growing success in both Canada and the United States, it only made sense that the Kids in the Hall would, in the vein of their heroes Monty Python, make their own movie on their own terms. And they did. And that would turn out to be one of the biggest miscalculations for the group, causing them to break up and almost for good. 1996's Brain Candy, a film about a struggling pharmaceutical company that hits on a potent antidepressant which becomes a massive success only to drive people into comas where they relive their favorite memories on loop, was supposed to be a triumph for the kids when their TV show ended in 1995. But the making of the film was marred with infighting. Dave Foley, who had recently been cast in the NBC show The Highly Underrated News Radio, left the group over creative differences. Though he does appear in the movie, it's because he was contractually obligated, and it's sparingly at best, and he even lost his writing credit on the film, causing further tension within the group. Worse than the infighting was the fact that during the making of Brain Candy, each member of the Kids in the Hall seemed to be going through their own personal tragedy. As Scott Thompson later explained about the filming, quote, "In the period of a month, Dave's marriage broke up, one of Kevin's parents died, and my brother committed suicide. All those things conspired to make it a dark time. And it definitely didn't help everyone's mood that the subject of their comedy was literally about depression." To make matters worse, the kids, probably for the first time in their entire careers, were reporting to higher-ups who weren't too happy with the movie's subject matter, specifically Bruce McCulloch's character, Cancer Boy. Cancer Boy was meant to mock celebrities who sought the spotlight with sick children, but the studio thought it was a bad taste jab aimed at the kids. They desperately wanted the character cut, but the group refused. "I love Cancer Boy more than anybody," McCulloch told the AV Club. "I was tired of the way that little kids with cancer were used by celebrities for photo ops. If the kid goes into remission, does Wayne Gretzky still visit him?" The other cast members echoed McCulloch about the controversial joke and still defend it to this day. The Cancer Boy controversy didn't matter anyways, as Brain Candy was a complete and total box office bust, though naturally, it has since become something of a cult film, which is completely on brand with the Kids in the Hall. The movie didn't even make $3 million when it was released. Roger Ebert probably sums up best everyone's initial response to Brain Candy when he said, quote, "I did not laugh once. I thought this movie was awful, dreadful, terrible, stupid, idiotic, unfunny, labored, forced, painful, bad." Hey, don't sugarcoat it, Raj. Tell us how you really feel. The troupe took a 4-year hiatus after Brain Candy's release, though the breakup was already in motion even before filming was underway. But that dissolution of the group wasn't the end for the Kids in the Hall. They've reunited a few times in the past 2 decades for live tours, even returning to TV in 2010 with The Kids in the Hall Death Comes to Town. And each of the kids still works, whether it be acting, writing, or directing. As the Kids in the Hall are all now firmly entrenched in middle age, they are most definitely not kids anymore. But their legacy remains strong and, in fact, has never weakened. Despite not hitting true mainstream success, their influence is undeniable. Said member Kevin McDonald, quote, "I think we're like the musical group The Replacements. They didn't sell a lot of albums, but they paved the way for groups like Nirvana."